like to start off by reading something one of my students in my 20th century world history class wrote for me after we studied the Holocaust. I've called it Scourge. Hate is a darkness that casts shadows over the world and stains the soul of its bearer. Hate gives the illusion of strength, while in truth, those who hate are weak. Hate's legacy is one of pain and sorrow. Nothing good, nothing beautiful can come from hate. Hate destroys families, destroys trust, destroys lives, destroys even its bearers of decency. Hate is never satisfied. Hate grows. Hate one person, hate that group, hate that country, hate the world, hate yourself. Hate has no place in this world. Hate needs to be fought. First, within ourselves, we must remove hatred. We must learn to love. Then we must stand against those who hate. We must not be silent. We must never allow our silence to be thought of as consent. We must take action. We must embrace our neighbors. We must love all, even those who hate. Grace may save some, but if we must, with sorrow in our hearts, we will stand and fight against those bent on destruction. For the good of humanity, for our own humanity, we cannot sit by and allow injustice to run rampant in the world, or else we are as guilty as those who hate. That was by Adam Schock, and he was a student here, probably 8 years ago, maybe. Where did all this hatred toward the Jews, this anti-Semitism, come from? It started well over 2,000 years ago and has been called the world's longest hatred. Some people said that it was the Jews who killed Christ. They are Christ killers, not knowing or forgetting, perhaps, that the place where Jesus lived was ruled by the Romans. The Jew was seen as haters, by the haters as an enemy and a threat to be converted, expelled, or killed. The famous Martin Luther in 1543 gave his own take on the Jews and their religion. He called them poisonous, bitter worms. They should be stripped of all their possessions. They should all be gathered up and put under one roof, preferably a stable, and made to do hard labor. Then they should burn down their homes, their synagogues, and everything they have destroyed, and then drive them out of the country. Well, mass expulsion of the Jews became an everyday occurrence in places like England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Bohemia. The oppression against the Jews continued on until the 19th century, when Jews were allowed to take part in the life of their country. They could become doctors, lawyers, teachers, etc. But this deep prejudice and pure hatred of the Jews never really disappeared. No decade in the 19th century went without someone crying that the Jews committed blood libel, which is the killing of little Christian babies to get their blood to make their Passover bread. No evidence of that ever was shown. No amount of education seemed to wipe this anti-Semitism from people's souls. This hatred could arise out of nowhere. It could be because they said the economy is bad and it's the Jews' fault. Or it could be used as a political ploy when they were looking for some scapegoat. Some Jews worked toward assimilation, taking full part in society. Others kind of retreated into their own communities so that they could not have any confrontations. overall, Jews, like most people, wanted to lead quiet, productive lives and reasonably comfortable lives. Now, Adolf Hitler was born in Austria in 1889 into a Europe that had mixed feelings about the Jews. But this outward situation didn't affect him for a few years. Adolf's parents, Clara and Alois, were second cousins. His father wanted him to get a good education so he could become a civil servant like himself. Hitler wanted to be an artist. He didn't want anything to do with civil service. And so that probably influenced him in his not paying attention in school, getting bad grades. He was a very poor student. He was often beaten by his father, and at best, you could describe Adolf's relationship with his dad as tumultuous. However, his mother, Clara, thought he was the apple of her eye, and she always defended him and tried to protect him. Alois Hitler died in 1903, and from that point on, Adolf Hitler was trying to pressure his mother into letting him go to Vienna because he wanted to attend the Fine Arts Academy there. Well, finally, in 1907, she gave in. She gave her permission and a little money to Adolf to go to Vienna. But later that year, in December, his mother, Clara, died of cancer, and Adolf Hitler was just devastated. Her doctor was Jewish, and many feel that Hitler blamed him for the death of his mother, and perhaps that contributed to his anti-Semitic feelings. But at the same time, he had been living in Vienna where they had, where existed this anti-Semitism throughout society. Now, he tried to enter the Fine Arts Academy twice. Whoops. Both times, the people on the application board said that his drawings weren't very good. They weren't good enough. Not to me, I can't draw stick figures. That looks pretty good. But they said his technique was leaning more toward architecture. Perhaps he should become an architect. But he didn't have a high school diploma, so they didn't accept him, and architecture schools would not accept him at all. So when he was turned down the second time, he started blaming the Jews on the board. They kept me from, doing what I've always wanted to do, become a great artist. So, starting early, he found the Jews as his scapegoat. And he did not take responsibility for his own actions. When he was in Vienna, he lived very poorly. He didn't have a lot of money. He would draw postcards and sell them to people on street corners. He would take out odd jobs. He would have to go to soup kitchens to eat. And he lived in a male shelter for where he could sleep. When World War I began in 1914, Hitler decided he wasn't going to fight in the Austrian army. He wanted to fight with the German army. So he left Austria before they could draft him, and he joined the German army, where he served in both France and Belgium. He was decorated twice for bravery, and he was also injured twice, wounded. twice. Once at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and the second time he was made blind by a gas attack and was sent to a hospital to recuperate and hopefully regain his sight. While recovering, Germany surrendered in 1918, and this totally enraged him. He said that this was a betrayal of an undefeated Germany by Jews and socialists. Jews did not serve in the army, and he also said Jewish bankers did not give up enough money to help the cause. He had found his scapegoat once again. Actually, 100,000, more than 100,000 Jews had joined the German army, and over 12,000 had been killed during World War I. So he is starting with his lies. He also said that the Treaty of Versailles was a humiliation for the German people. Germany was blamed entirely for the war, and he blamed the Jews once again. The Germans they were blamed for the war, but they also had to pay reparations. And by the way, those reparations were finally paid off in October of 2010. And made the front cover of Time magazine. He still resented the Jews. He said it's all their fault that we lost. And his hatred, his resentment toward the Jews knew no bounds. Anti-Semitism in the 1920s started building. It wasn't just Hitler talking out against them. And this anti-Semitism sometimes became very brutal. There were Jews who were beaten, Jews that were called nasty names, and some were killed. Anti-Semitism also became the basis for a new party, a new political party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the NSDAP, or Nazis, better known as the Nazis. Hitler was asked by the army, while he was still in the army, to infiltrate this new party and report back to the army what he found out. Well, he got there and he liked what they said. He was very interested. He started giving his own speeches. He thought he had a pretty good talent for giving speeches. What he would do would grab people's fears and worries and kind of twist them around, manipulate them to his own end. And he rose in the ranks of this party. He even helped them write their party platform, especially the views on race. They called the party nationalist. The state came first, and individual rights be damned. The Nazis also said, we want to create a great Germany, and we want our colonies returned to us. They were stripped of their colonies in the Treaty of Versailles. Then it went on to say, only those of pure German blood could be citizens of Germany. No Jews allowed. Only Aryans. That Aryan race, that non-existent race. Now, there was an Aryan tribe once that moved in on India centuries before, but there is no Aryan race. All Jews, the platform went on to say, who came to Germany after 1914 were to be returned to their countries, wherever that was. And that affected 18,000 Jews. At rallies, Hitler told the crowd that the Nazi Party and his party alone will free you from the power of the Jew. He then demanded the removal of the Jews from the German people. Then in 1921, Hitler created the SA, the stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung. I don't speak German, so I probably butchered that name, but he created them, and their job was to harass Jews and any opponents, usually rather brutally. So he had his people bully others. And he had other people act for him. Everybody else did his dirty work for him. Now, without any basis in truth, he would go on in his speeches and accuse Jewish boys of lying in wait for an unsuspecting true German girl because they wanted to seduce her and adulterate her blood and separate her from her people. Jews want to muddy the German or the Aryan bloodline. Jews want to break down the barriers of discrimination. As long as Germans remain racially pure and are conscious of the treasure of their blood, they can never be overcome by the Jew. Lies, just more and more lies. And Hitler, however, practiced that old technique. If you say it loud enough and long enough, people will believe you. So he had the repetition. Now, many in Germany at the beginning started believing him. They thought, well, maybe he has a point, because things weren't going so well in Germany right after the war. The economy was not doing well, and they owed all this money. But to take advantage of this, he went on to say, he was handing the German people a reason why Germany had lost the war, why Germany had been humiliated by that Versailles Treaty, and why the economy was so bad after the war. It was because of the Jew. So then in November, things were heating up for him. November of 1923. Hitler and 3,000 of his followers tried to take over Bavaria in what was known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Took place the 8th and 9th of November 1923. It was a violent uprising where 16 Nazis and 3 policemen died. Hitler was arrested, tried, sentenced to 5 years, but he only served 9 months. So he tried a failed coup. So he goes to jail, doesn't stay there very long, but while he is in jail, he writes Mein Kampf, My Struggle, where he talks about his plan for the European takeover and his ideas on race. He said, Jews are parasites. They should be exterminated. Countries should be based on race, and Aryans were the master race. Dictatorship or authoritarianism should govern. And when the book came out in 1925, a lot of people saw it and said, this guy's nuts, which also tells you that you should trust your first impressions. Around 1925, the economy was getting better under the new government, and people weren't paying too much attention to him. But in 1929, when the Wall Street stock market crashed, people, and it affected a lot of countries, people started listening to Hitler once again. In 1928, the Nazis gained 12 seats in the Reichstag, the German parliament. In 1932, Nazi seats numbered 230 out of 607. Nazis were the largest party, but they were not the majority. Hitler wanted to be named Chancellor of Germany. And in a lot of history books, it just says he was made Chancellor in January of 1933. But I found a book. It's a diary of a man, and I'm going to murder his name, Friedrich Percival Reck Malzuen. He was an aristocrat, and he started keeping a diary about Hitler and what was going on in Germany. And for that, he was eventually arrested and killed. But he said that around the time Hitler wanted to be named Chancellor, the Nazis had something on the president's son. The president was Paul von Hindenburg. He was a very old man, very sickly, and not very rich. And he was hoping that he could leave something to his son. So his son used some of the state money and invested it in the stock market, and things were looking up for him, he thought, until the crash. He lost state money. The Nazis knew this, and they put it to, according to this man, they put it to Hindenburg, we will put your son in jail if you don't name him Chancellor. Well, the other side, they said Hindenburg was very sickly, and he was in bed when Hitler went to his home to get him to name him Chancellor. There are those that said Hindenburg hated Hitler. He didn't know that he was talking to Hitler when he named him Chancellor. But he named him Chancellor of a coalition government in January 1933. How he got that's a little cloudy. But he's in that position over a coalition government. He could not stand being, sharing power with these other groups. So in March of 1933, he just declared himself the Führer, the leader, the head dictator in a couple of months later. And from that point on, the law was going to be whatever he wanted to be. And he said, only I can make Germany great again. He said it first. He also said to the people, I am doing the Lord's work. From 1933 onward, Nazis worked to exclude Jews and other undesirables from German life. They took away Jews' citizenship so they would be more easily deported. He took away their civil service jobs. He would not let true Germans go to Jewish shops and buy their supplies. Stormtroopers would keep them out. They would also mark the windows with Jew and then the star. They made They destroyed businesses and homes and synagogues on the Night of Broken Glass, known as Kristallnacht, that took place on the 9th of November, 1938. They set fire to synagogues, they humiliated Jews, they arrested many Jews and sent them to the concentration camp Dachau, the first concentration camp. The SA felt free to bully, beat up, or kill Jews encountered on the streets. They would even, if there was a foreigner in a town and they would pass by stormtroopers and they didn't raise their arm and say Heil Hitler, they had at times beaten those people up, people who weren't German, beat them up. There was one occasion where they tortured this one man by peeling off his skin. He was an American. They didn't think they'd have to acknowledge Hitler with a salute. Now, the SA was free to do their dirty work until something called the Night of the Long Knives that took place from June 30th to the 2nd of July, 1934. The SA worked well for Hitler in those early years, but he thought they were too emotional. He wanted to, now that he was chancellor, he wanted to be represented by a very disciplined group of men, which was the SS. So on the Night of the Long Knives, the SA was gathered, and the leaders, like Rome, was sent to a room, handed a gun, and told to do the right thing. So they either scared everything out of the SA and made them, foot soldiers or do something else, or they had them kill themselves. And then the SS was the most prominent group. From 1933 to 1939, hundreds of thousands of Jews left Germany, albeit without their possessions. There were about maybe 163,000 Jews left. And those that remained lived in constant fear and uncertainty. Now, in, I think it's 646, I think it is in my old room, up at the top of the ceiling, I have a name of a country and then a number. It's the number of Jews from the country that were killed. And I believe the one for Germany is 163,000. So from that point on, Hitler felt he could do anything he wanted, and he was going to try it. In March of 1938, he saw the fulfillment of one of his dreams. Hitler was born in Austria. He wanted Austria to become part of Germany. So, excuse me, in March of 1938, German soldiers, Nazis, marched into Austria and took it over and made it part of Greater Germany. Now, in more recent years, the Austrians like to say that they were Hitler's first victims. There were thousands of Gentiles out on the street waving little Nazi flags. They were not, being taken over. They were joyous about Hitler coming in, one of their own coming back. So in March, the Anschluss took place, and now Germany had gained more territory. Then on September the 1st, 1939, war began with Hitler's blitzkrieg attack on Poland, only after he had made a deal with Stalin saying, okay, we can split Poland. You come in from the east, I'll come in from the west, we'll take over Poland. Well, he came in sooner than the Russians did. And with the blitzkrieg, that's air cover, bombing from the skies, tanks, foot soldiers, and working very, very fast to take it over. Now, the reason Hitler made that deal with the Russians, not because he liked them, he just didn't want a two-front war like there had been in the First World War. So he made Stalin think that he was a friend until he wasn't. With the takeover of Poland, World War II had begun in Europe, and his campaign to take over Europe had started. Went in every territory he came into to take over. He then enacted his racial policies in areas that they now occupied. Thousands of Jews were forced into ghettos, especially in Poland at this point. They were forced into ghettos where crowding, unemployment, poverty, hunger, and disease prevailed. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest ghetto in Poland. This was an area of 1.3 square miles, and they used it. They brought in Jews from all over Poland and put them in the Warsaw Ghetto. At its height, there were 400,000 in this 1.3 square mile area, and it came out to 7.2 people per room in the existing buildings in that one area. They would take people out every once in a while. 1,000 people would gather, and they'd take them out and ship them to a camp where most of them were killed within the first hour and a half. Now, he wanted to kill the Jews. He also wanted them to stand out. They could more easily be recognized and have people, abuse them. In Poland, they wore armbands with a blue star of David on it. In other areas where he conquered territory, Juda for Germany, Juif for France, and they must wear those stars. If they didn't, and someone knew they were Jewish, they would have been shot. Now, Hitler also wanted to rid the world of communists, political opponents, the disabled, those with mental illness, gypsies, and to do that, they used them to experiment on. They would put them in a bus and get a hose that went into the bus from the exhaust and see how long it would take to kill the busload of people from the exhaust. They practice using something new called Zyklon B. To see how long it would take to gas people before they died. Zyklon B would later be used in death camps for the killing of Jews, and their experiments in mass killing. Now, of the 1.3 million Jews that entered Auschwitz, for example, 1.1 million died, most of them in the gas chamber. Others from overwork, starvation, disease. And this is Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka. At Treblinka, they experimented with how we can get these people off the train without freaking out, without going berserk. We want to keep them calm. So at the Treblinka station, they built up the facade of a regular railroad station. They had a band playing. People got off the train, out of the boxcars, and when everyone was off, then they brought out the dogs and started the selection. The men to one side, women, old people, children to the other, and they would march them into the camp. The men would be held in like a parade ground, and they were told to run in a circle, and if they stopped, they got shot. Just keep running and running and running. The women were taken to get their hair cut off, to strip naked and their clothes would be taken from them, and then marched down a road called Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven. At the end of this road was a gas station, a gassing shower, and they would go in there, be gassed, and when all the women had been taken care of, the old people, the children, then they marched the men down there. Many of them would be killed within the first hour and a half of arrival, all because of hatred. Now, when they saw how well Zyklon B was working, then they decided to use that in other camps as well. And the mass transports of Jews pushed into cattle cars and began in earnest in 1942. This was Hitler's final solution to get rid of the Jews. At first, the Jews were just taken to Treblinka, then Auschwitz and Belzec. From 1942 to 1945, Jews from all over Europe were sent to killing centers, and millions were killed. More than 6 million, it is said, of European Jewry were killed during what has been called the Holocaust, the burning. It comes from the Greek. The Jews would be killed from gassing, firing squads, beatings, medical experiments, hangings, death marches like this one, hunger, disease, and being worked to death. Why? Because they were born, and born Jewish. By 1945, some 275,000 deemed handicapped from all over Europe were also killed. Why? Because of hatred, because of misplaced feelings of superiority, because of their own inadequacies. Numbers like 6 million is a dry way overall, gives you a picture of what happened. But every man, woman, and child, and there was a special campaign to kill children so they wouldn't grow up and have babies. Every one of these people killed had a name. You don't usually hear that with numbers. They had a name, they had a family, they had hopes and dreams for their futures. They weren't just numbers. Hitler, as much as he tried to get somebody else to do his dirty work, he wasn't able to kill all of Europe's Jews, although it is thought that he killed about 2/3 of them. It is thought that 3.5 million Jews survived. So I'd like to tell you about some of my friends that were struggling through the Holocaust and survived, and this man moved to Baltimore, of all places, after the war. His name is Leo Breitholtz. Leo was 17 when the Nazis took over Austria in March of 1938 in what was called the Anschluss. On March 16th, Hitler and his Nazi troops were in Vienna marching down the street. Leo saw Hitler in his motor car going down the street with his arm raised. And he looked straight ahead, but they said he kind of glanced from side to side. Leo, a Jew, is standing amongst all these cheering Austrians with their little Nazi flags. And he couldn't figure out, what was going on. And he went back to his aunt's house, and they were all cringing in a back room. They were not allowed to go to the windows to see what was happening. But they knew it was bad. The next day, after Hitler's arrival in Vienna, Jews were being arrested, especially young men. They were going to be deported and sent to labor camps. That's what the people were told. Sons went off, and they were never seen again. Families would, in a few weeks' time, get ashes in the mail. saying, your son died of disease, your son died from an accident. The son died from being killed by Nazis. Leo's mother was she was extremely worried for her son. She thought he would be deported as well, and she kept pushing him to leave Vienna, and he didn't want to because he was the man of the house. His father had died in 1930. He had a widowed mother and 2 younger sisters. But eventually, it took about 6 months, he left Vienna at the urging of his mother. He left on the 25th of October, 1938. That was the last time he saw his family. He spent the next 7 years on the run from the Nazis. He would get arrested and escape, arrested and escape. He always looked for a way to escape. And the most audacious escape he had was from a boxcar on its way to Auschwitz. I have another picture of this, but he and another man tried to go to Switzerland because they heard it was a neutral nation. It was not. They had a camp where they kept Jews. They hid Nazi gold. And just as Leo and his friend crossed into Switzerland thinking they were home free, he had walked through the snow, through the cold, on bloodied feet. He couldn't get his socks off because of that. As soon as they got in, they were arrested. They sent him and the other man back to France, where he went from one camp to another, finally ending up in Drancy, which is just north of Paris. It was a transport camp. He and this other man, Manfred Silberwasser, got to know each other. They were put in the same boxcar, the same cattle car that was on its way to Auschwitz. He was pushed in this car with 50 other people. It was very crowded. You could not sit down. You could just kind of lean into the next person. In the middle of this car was a bucket where you could relieve yourself, men and women, no privacy. So here the train starts up and everyone is jostled, falling around. It didn't take long, they say, for that bucket to fill up. It's jostled, it tips over, and they're in there with that odor. I got this book, that's Leo. I got this book at the Shoah Memorial in Paris, and I was quite surprised to be able to look at it and say, I know these people. And I went up to the counter and I said, this is Leo Breithotz and that's Manfred Silberwasser. And they just looked at me like I had 2 heads. But in that boxcar, Manfred and Leo decided they were going to figure out a way to get out before it got into German territory. So he took his sweater off, put it in the moisture on the floor, human waste, because it makes the sweater more tensile in strength. And he put it around the bars in the window, and they pulled on it and pulled and wrapped and pulled until they got the bars warm enough so they could bend them just enough, they thought, to slip through. It took them 8 hours, 8 long hours. But they were quite motivated. So they finally slipped through and jumped. When they jumped, he made his way toward Lyon, and he joined a resistance group, a Jewish resistance group called the Sixth. And they made false IDs for children and then delivered them. And even just delivering them was it was hard to do. He was on a train about to deliver these IDs to children in a town called Oradour, and he noticed on the road next to the train tracks all these German soldiers marching in the same direction. He said, if he told himself, if Nazis are going in that direction, I don't want to go there. So he got off at the next station and made his way back to where they met. And the station after the one where he got off was Oradour. Everyone on that train, when they got off, was arrested, put in a church with the townspeople, locked the doors, and the Nazis set it on fire. He escaped death one more time. Actually, he escaped death quite a few times. At the end of the war, he made his way to the United States in 1947. Leo got married, he got a job, he had children, he became an American citizen, but he did not know what happened to his mother and his two sisters for 20 years. He found out in 1962 when he received a notice from the Austrian government saying, name, his mother's name, and his sisters' names. They were taken from Vienna in 1942 and never returned, which was a rather cold, cryptic way of announcing their murders by the Nazis. He found out later that they were taken to a town called Izbica, which was a transport camp, and shot. After that, when he found that out, he felt he had an obligation to tell people his story. He had lost 50 members of his family. Just put yourself in his place. 50 members killed. He felt he had an obligation to tell their stories, to tell his story, so that what happened during the Holocaust would not happen again. He hoped education would handle that, would take care of that. So for 50 years, Leo gave about 50 talks every year. This is a boxcar like the one he was shipped out in, and that stands in the town of Drancy. And then there's that same picture of him with Manfred. Leo also met with Garrett College students. He met with them in Baltimore for lunch and a chat. Now, my students would sit around the table and they didn't know how to start a conversation, and they're wondering what to say. And he put them at ease because he started everything off every time we went down there with a bawdy joke. And then they thought, did he just say that? Okay, and then they started talking. Leo, in his life, also worked to get France to admit their cooperation with the Nazis and pay reparations to survivors from Drancy that were now living in the United States. They had already paid reparations to survivors shipped from Drancy in all the European countries. They just hadn't settled up with those in the United States. He told me once that after D-Day, after Paris had been liberated, the French National Railroad sent a bill to the Nazis for services rendered. The railroad was called the SNCF, and this bill said they were paid for each trip, they were paid for every person on board, and they were paid for the mileage. And they sent that bill even after they had been liberated. So Leo worked to get them to acknowledge their cooperation, and 9 months after his death in 2014, they made an agreement to do so. Leo died a day and a half after his 93rd birthday in 2014. This is Helena Silber. Did anyone hear her speak? Yeah, there were about 400 in the auditorium, I think, that holds 300. People were on the floor, on the steps, on the stage. Helena Silber was number 16 on Schindler's List. And she said she was saved more than once by Oskar Schindler. Helena is this very tiny woman. I don't even think she's 5 feet. Very sweet, doesn't hold a grudge. But she was born in Krakow, Poland in 1939 when the Nazis occupied Krakow. She was 10 years old. The Nazis set up a ghetto in Krakow and said, you can move into the ghetto or you can move into this small town a few miles away that we've set aside for Jews. Her parents went there with the family. She was one of 7 children. So they moved into this town in 1941. And her sister and her brother had already left to work in a labor camp in Krakow. In 1942, the Germans began to remove Jews from these small towns, telling them, you're going to go to a better place. In the summer of 1942, her mother heard that they were going to liquidate her little town. So she told Helena, who was then 12, to rip off her yellow star and walk or maybe catch a ride to Krakow, where she could look up her brother and her sister in this labor camp. Well, she got to Krakow. She was stopped by the Gestapo. She had no papers, so they put her in jail, 12 years old. Then she was put in a labor camp until she was told that she would be working for Oskar Schindler in his factory that made enamel pots. So she went there to work, little tiny things. She's carrying these heavy enamelware pots stacked up. And she said, one day, Mr. Schindler saw me. She said, it's never good to be noticed by a Nazi. He walked over to her, and she is scared to death. And he said, wouldn't you rather clean my offices? And she said, oh yes, please. So she spent the rest of the time in Krakow cleaning his offices. So she worked there until the fall of 1944, when they were told that Schindler's factory in Krakow was being shut down, and they were going to move it to Czechoslovakia because the Allies were getting too close. So they put the men on one train to go to Czechoslovakia, the women on another train. The men got there, the women's train somehow got sent to Auschwitz, where they were, their hair was shorn. They were sent to the showers, and they were sure, that's it, we're dead. And water came out. She said it was the coldest, best shower she's ever had. They were in Auschwitz for a few weeks while Schindler was trying to pay off people at Auschwitz to send them into Czechoslovakia. They eventually did, and he used the money he made to give them food, to buy yarn so the women could make sweaters. He bought weapons for the men. She said they knew that he was a Nazi. They knew that he was a womanizer and a drunk. But she said, you don't have to be a saint to do saintly things. He saved them. Another man that I knew, another friend, was Martin Gray. We saw this picture before of the Warsaw Ghetto. That's Martin Gray. They found that picture about 5 years ago. And when he was his parents were, his father was Jewish, his mother was Catholic. They said, oh, you don't look Jewish, whatever that means. And when they were pushed into the ghetto, he decided his father left to fight with the Polish army. And he said, I'm the man of the house, I have to feed my family. So he gathered money from different people. This was a really strange setup, I think, for a ghetto. With a walled ghetto, 1.3 miles, there's a trolley that goes right through it. In one end, out the other. There were guards on it to make sure Jews did not get on. But he paid off the guards on the trolley. He would go out wearing a cross around his neck and buy food, come back in, pay the guards again, and distribute the food. And he would do this several times a day for months. One day he saw that his mother and two brothers had been gathered up and were going to be shipped out to Treblinka. And he felt, I have to join them. So he did. And while at Treblinka, he saw his mother and his two brothers leave. He was alone, made a Sonderkommando, which is someone that cleaned out the gas chambers. And he did that for a while and decided, I got to get out of here. And he had a belt. And when a truck came into the lower camp where he worked, he crawled under it, used the belt to strap him to the undercarriage, and when the truck left the lower camp and went to the upper camp, he was underneath. When it stopped, he undid the belt, and he looked for someone he knew that made assignments, work assignments. And they put him on near the train station. He would gather up the clothes in bundles, put them on the train. He decided he would make a place for himself, put the clothes on top of him, and he worked at the floor of the train, and he was able to escape after it left Treblinka. He joined a resistance group, making his way back to the Warsaw Ghetto, was there for the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943. His father was there. He found him again, only to have his father killed, standing right next to him during the uprising. When things were looking bleak, he went into the sewers and escaped. He joined another resistance group, and then the Russians that were making their way to Berlin. When he got to Berlin and the war was over, he made his way to the American sector, and they helped him get to New York to live with his grandmother. He lost over 100 people in his family. He met and married his wife in the United States. She was a model. They moved to the south of France, where a few years later, with 4 children, a fire came through. The Mistral, the winds, kept shifting. And his wife put the children in the car with one of their dogs, had 5 minutes to go to the Mediterranean. The wind shifted, the fire overtook the car. He lost his second family like that. The guy didn't catch a break till like 1975. But he started a foundation named for his wife to teach people about fire. He became an environmentalist. A man who owned a lot of newspapers and magazines said he would help him with his foundation, and said, you can have the offices on the Champs-Élysées for free. So they moved in. They were conducting business, working to help the environment. When he also finished his first book called For Those I Loved, he gave the first hardback copy to this man that helped him. His name was Amaury. And the guy found out that Martin Gray was Jewish. And he sent his lawyers to kick them out of the offices on the Champs-Élysées. Later he found out why. Apparently that same man had given the same offices to the Nazis as a radio station during the war. So if walls could talk. He went on to tell his story about the war. He wrote 11 books, 12 books. 3 of them were in English. He encouraged people to do things. If it's art is your thing, he was so encouraging. I wrote him a letter because a student wanted to tell his story. I didn't expect to get an answer. He called me from France in 2011, and he continued to call me for 2 months, every 2 months, until he died in 2016. I was supposed to meet him this one time. I went to a conference in Paris, but he wasn't well. He told me to go to Berlin, and this was a guy, if he told you to do something, by golly, you better do it. So I did, and he said, write to me about it. And when I did, he called me and said, write a book. I went, that's not on my bucket list. But he kept encouraging me, and that was the result. Creating Light, where I talk about Leo and Martin, and then a man named Thomas Bergenthal, who was 10 years old at the end of the war, came to the US, pretty much wrote the book on international law and human rights. He's still alive at age 87. So I wrote that, and I finished it a few months after his death in 2016. The other man I mentioned was Thomas Bergenthal. I know I'm running out of time. He made himself useful to the Nazis as a child. The picture of the death marches, he was in the death march from Auschwitz in January, in that cold, with just that thin little striped uniform they gave them. And they put the children at the front of the line, and when he got tired, he would just filter to the back of the line. And then he'd work his way back up. Well, one time, when the column of people stopped, he was all the way in the back. The Nazis took all the children from the front to a church and shot them. And he survived. He ended up in a camp north of Berlin when it was liberated. His father was killed 2 days before the end of the war. His mother survived. He eventually made his way back to her. He came to the US to go to school. He graduated from Bethany College, NYU Law School, Harvard Law School. He wrote the book on human rights and international law. He became a professor at GW, George Washington, in Washington, D.C. He was made the American judge on the International Court of Justice in The Hague for 10 years, and a judge on the Inter-American Court. He was named as one of the investigators of the tragedies in El Salvador for the UN. He acted for the UN. And he is the nicest man, very funny. He stopped teaching at GW, about 7 years ago. And, but when these survivors tell their stories, they're not doing it to say, look at me, look what I did, look what I survived. They do it so that people who hear them, when the survivors die, they will continue to tell the stories of what happens when hatred takes root. They're hoping that people will stand up and fight against it. And Leo said many, many times, silence in the face of injustice is consent. When I talk about the Holocaust, it reminds me of a song that was sung in an old movie musical called South Pacific. And it says, you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. And my hope is that they'll be taught a different lesson, compassion, love for one another, help for one another. Thank you.